I never thought I would tell this story. It began with the ordinary disappearance of a girl on a popular trail and ended with a discovery that shocked even experienced detectives. 5 years of emptiness, a body in the foundation, and a woman who returned from the other world to tell her truth. Get ready, because this story is about how sometimes the desert is not just sand, but a witness to the most terrible crimes. I never thought I would tell this story. More than 10 years have passed, but those nights in the Sonoran Desert still come back to me in my dreams. I can still smell that distinct odor, a mixture of hot rocks, dust, and dry creosote, foreshadowing trouble. My name is Mark, and in 2011, I was a detective with the Missing Persons Division in Phoenix. This case didn't just ruin my career, it changed my understanding of how easily a person can vanish into thin air in broad daylight. It all started on Tuesday morning, June 14th. Arizona at this time of year is like a hot oven. The air shimmers, and the temperature in the sun reaches 42 degrees by 11 a.m. Emma Brown, a 20-year-old local college student, left home at 7:15 a.m. She was an athletic girl, an avid runner who knew South Mountain Park like the back of her hand. Surveillance cameras at the park entrance recorded her white Toyota Corolla at 7:42 a.m. Emma was alone. She parked near the entrance to Holbert Trail, taking only a half-empty bottle of water and her phone with her. No one ever saw her alive again. When she didn't return for dinner, her stepfather, Thomas Reed, called the police. By 10:30 p.m., I was already in the parking lot. Emma's car was still there, locked, with her bag containing her wallet and documents in the back seat. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. We began searching immediately, using thermal imaging cameras, but the night was too hot. The rocks gave off so much heat that the devices showed a solid yellow haze. The next day, a large-scale operation was launched. More than 50 volunteers, helicopters, drones with high-resolution cameras. We combed every inch of Scorpion Trail and the surrounding canyons. Search dogs initially picked up a scent, but it suddenly disappeared just 300 meters from the start of the trail, right in the middle of an open area. It was impossible. It looked as if the girl had simply evaporated or been picked up from the air. The only thing we found on the third day of the search was her cell phone. It was lying 2 meters from the trail, smashed against a rock. The screen was shattered, but what alarmed me most was that there were no fingerprints on the case, not even Emma's. Someone had carefully wiped it clean before throwing it away. Weeks turned into months. We checked every hospital, every motel along the highway, every abandoned hangar in the desert. Emma's financial accounts remained inactive. Her friends and family were polygraphed. Her stepfather, Thomas, seemed devastated, although even then I noticed how quickly he had gone from despair to dry acceptance of the facts. A year later, the case was classified as cold. The official report stated, "Lack of factual leads, probability of finding her alive, is minimal." I had to close the file, but every time I drove past South Mountain, I felt that the desert was hiding something. It was silent, like an NDA signed by the heavens themselves. 5 years passed. I had left the department and was working in private practice, trying to forget the face of the girl from the report. Then, one rainy day in October 2016, a former colleague called me. His voice was trembling. "Mark, you won't believe this. An old stable was demolished at a construction site in Cave Creek. They found remains in the foundation and a pendant with the initials EB. At that moment, I thought that the story of Emma Brown had finally come to an end. But I was wrong. It was only the beginning of a nightmare that made me question everything I knew about truth and lies. They say that the desert never returns what it has taken in its original form. It turns flesh into stone, memory into dust, and hope into a dry crunch underfoot. When I got the call that evening in October 2016, I was just trying to get used to civilian life. My office in downtown Phoenix was littered with papers about marital infidelity and insurance fraud. Small fry compared to the darkness I had been digging in before. My former partner, Sam, sounded like he had just seen a ghost. "Mark, it happened in Cave Creek. You know that old area outside of town, where the Silver Hoof stables used to be?" I knew the place. It was a neglected plot on the edge of the desert where the soil was so dry that nothing grew there except saguaro cacti, which looked like twisted skeletons. "The new owners decided to tear everything down to build an eco-hotel there," Sam continued, breathing heavily. "When the excavator started digging up the concrete slab under the main stable, it turned up something that shouldn't have been there. Remains. But not horse remains, Mark. Human remains. And that's not all. I got there in an hour. The sky over Arizona was covered with heavy clouds, a rare sight that made the landscape even gloomier. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, making a sharp sound like the crack of a whip. Sam met me at the dug-up foundation. He handed me a clear zip-top bag. Inside, amid the gray dust and concrete chunks, lay a thin silver chain. The pendant on it was tarnished with age, but the engraving was clear. The capital letters EB. My heart skipped a beat. I remembered that pendant. It was in the photo in the wanted poster I had kept on my desk for 3 years. A gift from her mother on Emma's 18th birthday. "The experts are already on site," Sam said quietly. The skeleton was walled up right into the foundation. Judging by all appearances, it happened about 5 or 6 years ago. That's when she disappeared. I stared into the hole where forensic scientists in white jumpsuits were carefully sweeping the dirt around the bones with brushes. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Emma disappeared on Scorpion Trail, 40 miles from this place. How did she end up under the floor of a private stable? Who could have had access to the concrete at Cave Creek and also been in South Mountain Park on that fateful morning? The news spread instantly. The evening news headline screamed, "The end of the Emma Brown mystery. Body of missing runner found." I saw her stepfather, Thomas Reed, on TV. He stood in front of the cameras, covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. It looked convincing. The city breathed a sigh of relief. The painful uncertainty had finally been replaced by grief that could be formalized in a funeral ceremony. But the next morning, the world was turned upside down. I was in a coffee shop when the emergency announcement came on the radio. The announcer stammered with excitement. "An incredible twist in the Brown case. While police are identifying the remains in Cave Creek, a young woman has just walked into the Scottsdale police station. She's exhausted, disoriented, but she claims she is Emma Brown." I dropped my paper cup. Hot coffee spilled onto my pants, but I didn't even feel the pain. I was already running to my car. When I got to the station, it was absolute chaos. Reporters, crowds of onlookers, dozens of police cars. I managed to slip inside thanks to my old badge. Sam was waiting for me in the hallway outside the interrogation room. His face was gray. "It's her, Mark. I don't know how, but it's her. A little older, thinner, different hair color, but the same eyes. She knows details about her childhood that can't be found on the internet." "What about the skeleton?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "The pendant? The initials?" "We don't know yet. But she claims she was kidnapped right off the trail, that she was held captive for all these 5 years. I walked over to the one-way mirror. A woman was sitting on a chair in the room. She was wearing an oversized men's jacket, probably thrown on by one of the officers because she was shivering despite the heat outside. Her hands were clasped together, her fingers twitching constantly. She looked like someone who had returned from the dead, but something about her posture struck me as strange. She didn't look like a victim who had finally gained her freedom. She looked like someone preparing for a decisive battle. She began to speak. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, as if she hadn't used her vocal cords in a long time. "He grabbed me on Holbert Trail," she whispered, staring into space. "A man in a mask. He dragged me into a white van. I couldn't see the road. It was dark. I was kept in a basement. Some hotel. Copper Rock. It smelled of old leather and bleach. He brought me food once a day. I didn't know what year it was. I just waited for him to make a mistake. I listened to her testimony, and cracks began to appear in my mind. Copper Rock Inn? It was an old motel on Route 17 that had been closed since 2012. But if she had been there, how did she look so clean? Her nails were trimmed, her skin showed no signs of the sores or dirt typical of prolonged captivity. Her story was perfect. Too perfect. "Sam," I called to my partner, "who owns that stable in Cave Creek where the skeleton was found?" Sam looked at his tablet. "The building belonged to some shell company, but we checked the archives. Until 2012, it was owned by Thomas Reed, Emma's stepfather." The cold in my veins turned to ice. If the skeleton in the foundation didn't belong to Emma, then who did it belong to? And why did Emma show up right now, the day after the news of the body's discovery spread across the state? She didn't run away. She came, and she brought with her a story that should have answered all my questions, but instead opened up an abyss that I had to look into. The desert had finally spoken, but what it told me was far more terrifying than a simple murder. It was a game, and Emma Brown had just made her first move. I stood behind the glass and watched Emma Brown slowly drink her water. She held the paper cup with both hands, as if trying to warm her palms, even though the room was air-conditioned and quite stuffy. Her gaze was fixed on a single point on the table. It was the gaze of someone who had stared into the darkness for too long. "Tell us about Copper Rock, Emma," Detective Sims, who was conducting the interview, said gently. "You said it was a hotel." She nodded, and a strand of hair fell across her face. "Copper Rock Inn. There were 8 rooms. They kept me in the basement, under the kitchen. The walls were rough stone, cold even in August. I could hear people walking above me, but no one could hear me. The floor was concrete, covered with a thin layer of dust that clogged my lungs. I wrote down every word she said. Her style of storytelling was strange, documentary, as if she were giving testimony under oath, avoiding unnecessary epithets, but at the same time filling the story with details that were impossible to invent. She described the brands of household chemicals the kidnapper used to clean the hallway, the exact time the generator turned on, and even the distance between the bed and the door. Exactly 4 steps. "Did you see his face?" Sims asked. Emma hesitated. "Never. He was always in the shadows or wearing a mask. He called himself the Guardian. He said the world outside was too dangerous, that he was saving me from chaos. He brought me books, but only old geology textbooks and maps of Arizona. He wanted me to know the land I lived on, but I never saw it." At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. I remembered the skeleton found in Cave Creek. If Emma was being held captive, then who was lying under the foundation of Thomas Reed's stable? Why was her pendant on that body? While Emma continued her confession, the story of a person who had remained silent for many years due to fear and pressure. I left the observation room and headed for the criminalistics department. I needed more information about the hotel. The Copper Rock Inn did indeed exist. It was a gloomy 2-story building in the middle of nowhere, 60 miles from Phoenix. It had been closed for health violations a year after Emma's disappearance. Detectives left for the hotel immediately. I went with them. When we arrived, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The building looked dead. Boarded-up windows, peeling paint the color of dried blood. We went inside, and the smell of old leather and chlorine that Emma had mentioned really hit us. We went down to the basement. The room was just as she had described it. Low ceiling, stone walls, heavy metal door. But there was one but. When the experts began to examine the room with ultraviolet lamps, they found no biological traces of Emma. No hair, no epithelial particles, no fingerprints. There was a bed in the corner, but the mattress was covered with a layer of dust that had not been disturbed for years. "No one has been here, Mark," said one of the officers, taking off his gloves. "At least not for 4 years?" I looked around. There was a pair of old shoes on the shelf, but they were men's, size 40. In a desk drawer, we found blank Western Geoservices termination forms. It was the same company where Arthur Graves had once worked, the man who would later be linked to this horror. We returned to the station late at night. Emma had already been transferred to the Sierra Vista Medical Center for a full examination. On the way, I received a message from Sam. "The preliminary DNA results for the skeleton are in. It's not Emma, but there's a 99.9% match on the maternal line." I pulled the car over to the side of the road. The air in the cabin became heavy. Emma's mother, Sarah, was officially reported missing a year before Emma herself disappeared. Thomas Reed told everyone at the time that she had simply left with another man, taking her belongings with her. We believed him because he had connections and seemed like a decent person. Now the picture was starting to take shape into something much more horrific. Emma wasn't the victim of a random maniac at the Copper Hotel. She came with a ready-made story to cover up something else. She looked well-groomed because she wasn't in the basement. She was somewhere else, hiding from her own stepfather, who had walled her mother into concrete. I remembered her eyes behind the glass. They showed no fear of the guardian. They belonged to a cold, calculating person waiting for her chance. She used the name of the hotel because she knew we would find a connection there to Graves or someone else who could be blamed. But why did she speak up now? Why let herself be found? The report from the psychiatrist who examined her that night said, "The patient shows signs of deep dissociation, but her cognitive functions are normal. She's not just remembering, she's dictating the script." I looked at the dark hills of Sonora in the distance. There, among the rocks and cacti, lay the truth that Emma Brown had decided to rewrite in her own way. She hadn't just returned from oblivion. She had returned to finish what she had started 5 years ago. I started the engine. I had to find Thomas Reed before he realized that the daughter who had returned from the dead knew much more about him than she was telling the police. The tension in the town was growing, like before a desert storm, when the air becomes so electrified that every touch causes a spark. As the sun began to rise above the horizon, flooding the Sonora desert with a blood-red light, I was still sitting in my car near the Sierra Vista Medical Center. Sam's words played over and over in my head like a broken record. 99.9% maternal match. That could only mean one thing. It wasn't Emma lying under the foundation of the stable in Cave Creek. It was Sarah Brown. I remember Sarah. She was a quiet woman who always seemed a little scared of her own shadow. When she disappeared in 2010, Thomas Reed, a successful developer and respected member of the Paradise Valley community, sent emails to all her friends on her behalf. In them, she supposedly wrote that she was tired of her dull life and was moving to California with a man she had met at a seminar. We didn't even open a murder case at the time because the correspondence continued for months. Thomas skillfully imitated her presence in the digital world while her body decomposed under a layer of concrete in Cave Creek. I entered the hospital, showing my ID. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Sam was standing outside Emma's room. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "The skeletal examination confirmed old fractures," he whispered, pulling me aside. "Broken ribs, wrists, and tibia. And most interestingly, they healed incorrectly. These are signs of systematic domestic violence, Mark." I looked through the small window in the door of the room. Emma lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. Her eyes were half open, and her gaze was completely empty, like that of a person whose consciousness had long since left her body. But now I knew that was just part of her game. She knew her mother had been killed. She knew where the body was. "Sam, do you understand what this means?" I asked. Emma didn't disappear because of a kidnapper. She ran away. She ran away from Thomas in 2011 because she saw him walling her mother into the foundation. She left her pendant on her mother's body as a marker. She knew that someday the stable would be demolished, and that pendant would lead the police to connect the discovery to her. Sam frowned. But then, why the story about the Copper Hotel and the Guardian? Why not just come and tell the truth? Because Thomas Reed isn't just a stepfather, I felt anger boiling up inside me. He has connections in the department. He has money. 5 years ago, Emma was a frightened girl. If she had just spoken up, he would have destroyed her before she could even get to the police station. She waited until there was irrefutable evidence. A body. I remembered her description of her captivity. He blocked the entrance. It doesn't work. A fragment from that half-worn notebook we found earlier. It wasn't about the cave. It was about her life in Thomas's house. He blocked her exit to reality. He erased her personality, turning her into a shadow that had to remain silent. My next step was to visit Thomas Reed's office. I wanted to see his reaction when he found out that Emma was back. His office was located in the upscale Paradise Valley neighborhood. Thomas met me in his office with a panoramic window overlooking the very mountains where Emma had disappeared. He looked impeccable, an expensive suit, perfect hair, but his fingers nervously fiddled with a gold-nibbed pen, just as Emma had described her kidnapper's movements. "Detective, it's a miracle," he said, his voice steady but too dry. "My girl is back. I've already booked the best doctors. I want to take her home as soon as they let me." "Home?" I walked over to the window. "Thomas, you know they found a skeleton in Cave Creek, with your pendant around its neck?" He froze. The second of silence in the office seemed like an eternity. "Yes, it's terrible," he finally said. "Probably the maniac who held Emma did it on purpose. He wanted to confuse the investigation." "Did you know that DNA showed it was Sarah?" I turned sharply. "Your wife who went to California?" Reed's face didn't change, but I noticed a vein bulging in his neck. "This is some kind of mistake, some wild speculation. I will only talk in the presence of a lawyer." I left the office, feeling the noose tightening. But I was still missing one piece of the puzzle. Where had Emma really been all these 5 years? And why did she look as if her body was alive, but her mind was long gone? I returned to the report on the discovery of Arthur Graves's camp, the same reclusive engineer. His diaries mentioned a student who endures darkness better than others. Graves really existed. He was a real shadow in the mountains. Perhaps Emma didn't invent him. Perhaps she found her only ally in this crazy geologist. "She is still afraid of the darkness, but the darkness will teach her," Graves wrote. It was not a kidnapping. It was a transformation. Emma went to the mountains not to die, but to become something that could stand up to Thomas. She studied the roots. She learned to navigate in the dark without instruments. She prepared her body for prolonged isolation. I remembered the details from the ward. Her fingers were cracked and her nails were scratched until they bled. She wasn't trying to get out of the cave. She was trying to get out of her old skin. She was preparing herself for the role of victim so she could return and deliver the final blow. All this time, we were looking for a lost girl, but we found a weapon that the desert had sharpened for 5 years. And now that weapon was aimed straight at Thomas Reed's heart. I got in the car and looked at my watch. It was 11:15 a.m., the same time Emma's signature last appeared in the park's visitor log 5 years ago. The circle was complete. All that remained was to wait for Emma Brown to make her next move in this deadly chess game, where not only justice was at stake, but also her own soul, which seemed to have been lost forever, somewhere in the dark crevices beneath Sonora. Several days had passed since her appearance, but the tension in the air remained. I could feel it physically, like static electricity before a storm. I needed to know where Emma Brown had spent those 5 years. The real answer did not lie in the gloomy basement of the hotel. It was somewhere out there, among the scorching sand and rocks, where a person becomes invisible to the radars of civilization. I began my own counter-investigation. Looking through old reports, I came across a mention of the Cactus Bloom Bakery in Tucson. It was a small place where no one asked unnecessary questions and payment was often made in cash. I went there, hoping to find at least some clue. The owner of the bakery, an elderly woman with hands covered in flour, looked at Emma's photo for a long time. Her name was Lily, she finally said, looking at me through her glasses. She came to me in the 11th year. She was scared, like a beaten puppy, but her eyes were too cold. She worked quietly and lived in a small room above the warehouse. She hardly spoke, as if every word cost her incredible effort. This confirmed my theory. Emma had run away. She changed her name and disappeared into the white desert of social anonymity to save her life. But why had she remained silent for so many years? Why didn't she go to the police immediately after her mother's death? The answer was found in the Internal Investigations Archive. Thomas Reed didn't just have connections. He was the main sponsor of the Police Veterans Support Fund, and his close friend headed the department that dealt with disappearances in 2011. Emma knew that any statement against her stepfather would be a death sentence for her before the protocol was even signed. I returned to the hospital to see Emma again. This time, she was awake. She sat by the window, watching the sunlight slowly creep across the linoleum. It reminded me of Graves's description of the student who studies light. "You were in Tucson, Emma," I said quietly, sitting down opposite her. "You weren't held captive by the Guardian. You worked in a bakery. You were in hiding." She didn't even flinch. Her gaze remained focused on the strip of light. "The desert isn't just sand," she began, her voice sounding as if it were coming from a deep well. "It's silence that eats you from the inside. I saw him do it. I saw him holding the trowel, smoothing the concrete. Mom was there at his feet, and he was smiling. He told me that if I squealed, I'd be lying next to her, that the police were his friends, that no one would believe a drug-addicted girl, which is what he would make me out to be." She finally looked at me. There was no madness in her eyes, only icy clarity. "I went to the mountains to disappear. I met an old man in the caves. He wasn't my kidnapper. He was my mirror. Arthur Graves taught me that there are no lies in the darkness. He taught me to survive on roots and water dripping from the walls. But most importantly, he taught me to wait." Emma told how she had been preparing for her return for years. She learned about the demolition of the stable from newspaper ads she sometimes picked up at gas stations near Tucson. She realized that when Sarah's bones were found, Thomas would do everything he could to blame some phantom maniac. "I needed a story they would want to hear," she continued, a faint, painful smile appearing on her lips. "A story about an unfortunate victim, about captivity, about the Copper Hotel. The police love stories like that. They give them a sense of control. I gave them the Guardian so they would start digging into the past." I understood her plan. It was a trap. She didn't just want justice. She wanted to see Thomas Reed corner himself, trying to justify himself through her lies. She was playing the role of a broken doll so he would relax, so he would believe she couldn't remember anything or had gone mad from isolation. "But why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who didn't come looking for me to close the case," she whispered. "You looked for me because you cared. Mark, he won't stop. He'll come here to take me home. And when he does, he has to be sure that I'm just a shadow." I left the ward, my hands shaking. It was the most dangerous game I had ever seen. Emma Brown wasn't saved. She was a hunter who used her own body as bait. And the desert just gave her space to sharpen her fangs. I got in the car and looked at my phone. I had to act fast. The next chapter of this story was going to take place at Thomas's house, and I had to make sure that this time the concrete wouldn't swallow the truth forever. The silence in the corridors of Sierra Vista Hospital was so thick that I could hear every beat of my heart. When I left Emma, my palms were sweaty. Now I knew the truth, but that truth was sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. Emma hadn't just survived. She had been transformed into something that the desert had tempered for 5 years in its scorching furnaces. I got into the car and reopened the file Sam had given me that morning. There was a new report from the medical commission. What I read made me shudder. Emma had been diagnosed with a rare form of progressive anemia and signs of a serious immune system failure. Her body was literally devouring itself. The doctor wrote in the notes, "The condition is critical. Immediate blood transfusion and complex bone marrow surgery are required. Without insurance and legal documents, treatment is impossible." There it was, the real reason for her appearance. Emma Brown didn't return because the guardian made a mistake or because she suddenly felt strong enough. She returned because she was dying. In Tucson's White Desert, working illegally at the Cactus Bloom Bakery, she had no access to medical care. When she heard on the radio about the body found in Cave Creek, which the press mistakenly identified as hers, she realized this was her last chance at life. She needed documents. She needed her mother's insurance, which she would inherit by law. She needed kidnapping victim status so that no one would ask where she had been for the past 5 years and why she hadn't paid taxes. The story about the Copper Hotel was the perfect shield. She knew that the police, blinded by their desire to close the high-profile case, would swallow this bait. I remembered her words. I came up with a fictional story about being held captive to get victim status, and at the same time to testify against my stepfather. She used her illness as a last resort. She knew that her trauma would allow her to remember the details of her mother's murder gradually, without arousing suspicion of perjury. But there was one more detail. The psychiatrist's report noted that Emma insisted on memory loss regarding certain periods. She claimed to have seen the guardian bringing her food, small rodents, roots, water with a metallic taste. It was a masterful blend of her real life on the run and fabrications based on old legends about Arthur Graves. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. It was Sam. "Mark, we have a problem. Thomas Reed just arrived at the hospital with his lawyers. He is demanding Emma's immediate release into his custody. He brought documents proving that he is her sole legal guardian, as she has been declared incapacitated due to mental trauma." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Thomas had figured out her game. He wasn't going to let her recover. He wanted to take her to his mansion in Paradise Valley, the same basement she had escaped from 5 years ago. There, behind a high fence, he could finish what he hadn't been able to do in 2011. "Sam, don't let him take her," I shouted into the phone as I pulled out of the parking lot. She knows the truth about Sarah. The body in Cave Creek is his doing. "We can't stop him without a warrant, Mark." Sam's voice rose to a shout. "Legally, he has every right. He brought a private ambulance with him." I stepped on the gas, running a red light. The desert around Phoenix now seemed to me not just a landscape, but a giant cemetery where a secret could be hidden under every layer of concrete. When I flew into the hospital lobby, I saw Thomas Reed. He stood in the center of the hall, calm and confident, in his impeccable suit. Next to him, 2 men in medical uniforms were already rolling a stretcher with Emma on it. She was pale as marble, but when our eyes met, I saw a brief flash in her eyes. It wasn't despair. It was a call. She wanted him to take her away. It was the final part of her plan. Emma knew that in the hospital she was protected only by the walls, but Thomas was just a visitor there. To break him, she needed to lure him into his own territory. She wanted him to feel his impunity, to relax within the walls of his home, and start talking. She didn't come to the police just for the documents. She came to be the bait in a trap she had constructed herself over 5 years of isolation. "Mr. Reed," I blocked his path. "Are you sure you want to do this? The desert has a way of returning debts at the most inopportune moments." Thomas looked at me with cold contempt. "Detective, you're no longer on the case. My daughter is coming home. She needs peace, not your conspiracy theories." They took her out onto the street. I saw Emma being loaded into a private ambulance. When the doors closed, I turned to Sam, who was standing nearby, clenching his fists. "Do we have surveillance at his house?" I whispered. Sam nodded, barely perceptibly. "We planted bugs yesterday while you were investigating in Tucson. But if he doesn't say anything, Mark, we've put her in danger. She may not survive the night." I looked at the mountains on the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the rocks the color of fresh blood. "She survived 5 years in the dark, Sam. She learned to talk to stones and listen for footsteps in the dark. Now it's Thomas Reed's turn to hear the voice of his conscience, even if that voice sounded like the whisper of a girl he thought was dead. The night in Paradise Valley always seemed artificial to me. Here, among the luxurious estates, behind high walls and perfect lawns, people tried to hide from the wild, uncontrollable nature of Arizona. But the desert cannot be tamed. It simply waits beyond the threshold. Thomas Reed's mansion towered over the road like a fortress made of cold stone and glass. I parked 2 blocks away, turned off my headlights, and turned on the receiver tuned to the frequency of the bugs Sam had managed to install in Reed's office and living room. My headphones were filled with static, occasionally interrupted by the sound of footsteps on marble and the distant rumble of ventilation. Suddenly I heard Thomas's voice, cold, devoid of the feigned concern he had shown at the hospital. "Did you think you could fool me with this story about the cave guardian, Emma?" His voice sounded muffled, as if he were approaching her. "I've seen a lot of liars, but you've outdone yourself. You led the police to the stable. You made them dig where I laid the foundation with my own hands." I held my breath. Emma was silent. That silence was her weapon. She knew Thomas couldn't stand the silence. His ego needed recognition of his power. "Why didn't you die in Tucson?" Thomas continued. Now I could hear the crackling of glass. He was probably pouring himself a whiskey. "I saw you on the camera footage 5 years ago. Did you think I wouldn't find out about the bakery? But I let you be there. I thought you would just disappear, dissolve into that white desert. But you decided to come back and put on this show with the Copper Hotel." Emma finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but through the headphones it sounded like a thunderclap. "I didn't come back for the money, Thomas. I came back so you would finally admit it. She was wearing the necklace. You saw it when you covered her with concrete. You saw her eyes." "Shut up," Reed barked. There was a sound of a blow, heavy, dry. "Your mother was weak. She was going to leave and take part of my business with her. I just sped up the process. And you were a witness I couldn't just get rid of without raising suspicion. That was it. The confession." Sam, in the surveillance van a few miles away, was already recording every word on a digital device. But I knew that Emmy was in real danger. Thomas wasn't going to let her live after this conversation. "You know what we're going to do now?" Reed's voice became eerily calm. "We're going to the Red Rock hangar. Remember it? That old warehouse by the runway that I use for equipment. No one will hear your fantasies there. That's where we'll end this kidnapping story. You just won't be able to handle the rehabilitation. Your heart will stop from the trauma." I rushed off without waiting for the command. The Red Rock hangar was located on the northern outskirts of the city in an industrial area bordering the open desert. As I drove along the night highway, I could hear the sound of a struggle in my headphones, followed by the sound of a car door closing. When I reached the hangar, Reed's black Range Rover was already there. The huge metal building reflected the moonlight, looking like a giant sarcophagus. I grabbed my gun and cautiously approached the side door. Inside, it was dimly lit, cut only by a single yellow light from a lantern standing on the floor, just like the lantern in Graves' diaries. Thomas stood in the middle of the hangar, holding Emma by her hair. She was so weak that her legs buckled. In his other hand, he held a heavy metal tool, a crowbar, which glinted in the yellow light. "Look around, Emma," he hissed. "There are no cameras here, no detective friends, just you, me, and the stone that will take you back in." "You're wrong, Thomas," I said, stepping out of the shadows and pointing my gun at his chest. "There were cameras in your house, and every word you said about Sarah and the concrete is already recorded on the police server." Reed froze, his face contorted with rage and the realization that he was trapped. He looked at Emma, then at me. At that moment, he didn't look like a successful businessman, but like a hunted animal that had spent too much time in the darkness of its own crimes. "You won't prove anything," he spat, but his voice trembled. "The evidence is on its way," I replied. Sirens could be heard in the distance. Sam and the SWAT team were close. Emma raised her head. Despite her pallor and bruises, her face wore the same strange, calm smile I had seen in the hospital. She knew she had won. The desert had finally repaid its debt. Thomas threw down the wrench and raised his hands. As they began to handcuff him, he was still muttering something about order must be maintained, reminiscent of Arthur Graves's delusions about being the keeper of order. I approached Emma. She was on the verge of fainting. Her pulse was weak and her breathing was uneven. "It's over, Emma," I said quietly. "You're free." She closed her eyes and whispered, "I just wanted her to be able to breathe." Down there, under the concrete, there wasn't enough oxygen. That night, the Red Rock hangar became the place where one big lie ended. But as the medics loaded Emma into the ambulance, I looked at the dark mountains around us. I knew that part of Emma would remain there forever, in the darkness she used as a shield. She survived, but at a price that could not be measured by documents or insurance. Several months have passed since the nighttime silence in Paradise Valley was shattered by sirens and screams. Arizona has returned to its usual state of waiting and scorching heat. For most Phoenix residents, the story of Emma Brown became just another headline that was gradually replaced by new sensations. But for me, as for her, this case will never become just an archive file. Thomas Reed was arrested that same night for first-degree murder and unlawful imprisonment. The trial was quick but grueling. The wiretap recordings and his own words in the barn left the defense no chance. When the prosecutor read out the details of how Thomas had personally walled Sarah Brown into the foundation of the barn, the courtroom was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioners running. Reed received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He ended his life the same way he intended to end Emma's, behind closed doors, where time has no meaning. Emma was not charged with perjury for her testimony about the Copper Hotel. Considering the years of psychological pressure, trauma, and her health, the prosecution decided that her actions were a form of self-defense. Her imaginary captivity was recognized as a defensive reaction of the psyche. Thanks to the publicity of the case and her status as Sarah Brown's heir, Emma finally gained access to the necessary finances and medical care. The bone marrow surgery was successful, although her recovery took a long time. Her body, accustomed to deprivation and survival, was slow to accept the help of modern medicine. Today, I visited her outside the hospital for the first time. We met at Green Acres Cemetery. It was a sunny morning, but the wind from the desert brought a pleasant coolness. Emma stood by a new black granite monument. Only one name was engraved on it: Sarah Brown. Emma looked different. She had gained a little weight, her hair had grown out, and there was a certain steadiness in her gaze. However, she still sometimes looked over her shoulder, as if checking for shadows in the corners. The doctors said it would stay with her forever, a habit of someone who had spent too much time waiting for danger. "I often think about Arthur Graves," she said quietly, without taking her eyes off the monument. "Did you ever find him?" "Officially, he's considered missing," I replied. "The police combed through all the known caves, but he just vanished into the mountains. Some say he went into vertical passages that even professionals don't dare to descend into. He said that darkness is the only place where it is impossible to find a person unless they want to be found. Emma touched the cold stone of the monument. He was part of my madness, but he was also my salvation. Without his lessons, I wouldn't have been able to come back. I looked at her and realized that Emma Brown was a person who lived in two worlds at once. One world was light, laws, insurance payments, and cozy apartments. The other was the smell of damp stone, the taste of water with a metallic aftertaste, and the endless silence of underground vaults. She had received her inheritance and could now live in peace. But I knew that sometimes at night she would wake up to whispers that no one else could hear and see shadows that no object cast. She had learned to live with it, just as she had learned to live with the knowledge that her mother was finally breathing, not under a layer of concrete, but in her memory. As we left the cemetery, Emma paused for a moment at the gate and looked toward South Mountain. "You know, Mark, the desert isn't evil," she said suddenly. "It's just honest. It shows you who you really are when everything is taken away from you." Thomas couldn't bear that truth, and I just learned to be part of that truth. I got into the car, watching in the rearview mirror as her figure grew smaller against the endless horizon. Emma Brown's story was formally over. The criminal was in prison, the victim was saved. But the Sonora Desert continues to keep its secrets. Somewhere out there, in the deep canyons, Arthur Graves still keeps his diaries, and the wind blows dust over the empty mines. For me, this case was a reminder. People don't just disappear. They change. They go into the darkness alone and return as someone else, bringing with them a piece of that night that will forever remain in their souls. And sometimes, to defeat the monster, you have to become a shadow yourself for a while. I closed the folder with the documents. It was full: photos, maps, reports. But the main document was not there. The final report on how to mend a broken soul. Because some things are taken away by the desert forever, and no courts or compensation can bring them back.